It's June 7th, 2016. Welcome to Raging Chicken Radio's Out to Coop podcast. Each week we check in with our Capitol correspondent, Sean Kitchen, on the good, the bad, and the ugly that is Harrisburg, PA. Raging Chicken Radio is a project of Raging Chicken Press. Check out all our citizen journalism at ragingchickenpress.org. You can subscribe to Raging Chicken Radio on Podbean, on Stitcher, Google Play Music, and iTunes. And subscribing to Raging Chicken Radio is one of the easiest things that you can do to help support this podcast and all the work that we do with Raging Chicken. Seriously, subscribe to these folks. It kicks us up in the ratings and more people get to hear what we're doing. And if you want to help build progressive activist media for PA and beyond, you can become a member of Raging Chicken Press, Raging Chicken Radio for as little as $2 a month. That's less than the cost of beer or a cup of coffee, folks. $2 a month. Come on, it's a steal. Raging Chicken turns 5 this July, and our 2016 membership drive is all about preparing for the next 5 years of pull no punches progressive media in Pennsylvania. You can be a part of help sustaining homegrown citizen journalism by becoming a member. Just go to ragingchickenpress.org and click Become a Member under the Support and Membership tab. Or if you're listening on Podbean, just click Become a Patron and you'll be on your way. Be sure to check out all the thank you gifts for each membership level while you're there. And we got stickers, we got posters, we got books, we got even opportunities to come on this podcast, folks. It's a whole lot of fun. And today's special, our membership drive is up. And today we'd like to say a special thank you to our 2 newest members, Rick and Lisa. Rick and Lisa each joined at the $5 a month level, which helps sustain our work so much. I thank you all so much for chipping in. In addition to today's episode of Out the Coop, we'll be releasing the latest episode of our interview series, The Sit Down. This week, I talk with Karen Ferridan, the founder of Burke's Gas Truth. Karen and I talk about problems with Obama's clean energy plan, some shakeups in the PA's Department of Environmental Protection, and the upcoming March for a Clean Energy Revolution on the eve of the Democratic National Convention right down the street in Philly. Now, this week, gotta say, it's a special Out the Coop, right? Because Sean, yes, he's not with us today, right? If you've been listening the last couple of weeks, Sean is on vacation in Boulder, Colorado. One of the craft brew meccas in the U.S., which always gets Sean kind of all happy and tingly. But we hope to catch up with Sean later this week with a live report from Boulder. That would be freaking awesome. And we'll get, whole perspective on his latest Rocky Mountain high. But today, it's a big day, right? Regardless that Sean's not here, it's a big day because today in California, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, North Dakota, South Dakota, they all got their primaries going on, folks. California's race is, of course, the big kahuna with 546 pledged delegates at stake. But in this increasingly tense race for the Democratic side, today's final Super Tuesday can't be without controversy, of course. I mean, that would just kind of, fly in the face of where we've been up until now. Last night, the AP and then NBC News and a slew of other broadcast media, and now today in the kind of print media, they reported that Hillary Clinton is the presumptive nominee based upon her super delegate commitments. This came after some of the AP reporters and some NBC reporters actually spoke to a bunch of the super delegates to see where they stood and that they still going to support Clinton. This is problematic for a bunch of folks, and frankly, the fact that the media has declared victory for Clinton before voters had a chance to go to vote today is leaving a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. So we'll get into that with my surprise special guest on today's Out the Coop, Glenn Richardson. Folks, Richardson is a professor of political science and public administration at Kutztown University. He's the author of Pulp Politics, How Political Advertising Tells the Stories of American Politics, published in its 2nd edition by Rowman and Littlefield. And he specializes in American government and political communication, especially campaigns and elections, political advertising, social media, and news coverage of politics. His articles include visual storytelling and the competition for political meaning and political advertising and news and Campaign 2000, which earned the 2002 American Communications Journal Article of the Year Award, and AdWatch 3.0, developing audio, visual, and narrative techniques for engaging the audio-visual content of political advertising in Peroi. He is currently working on projects focusing on the use of Twitter and politics and on political advertising. Richardson is also the chair of the state APSCUF Legislative Committee. APSCUF is the faculty union for the 14 state-owned universities in Pennsylvania. And so today we're going to get Richardson's take on today's primaries, the tensions of the Democratic Party, and what's happening in APSCUF's current contract negotiations, where faculty have been working without a contract for nearly a year. So, big breath, welcome, Glenn.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you. It's great to be with you this morning.
Man, it's so great to have you on, and I can't think of somebody, your name was the first one that popped in my mind, I knew Sean was going to be out, and we had a big primary day here today. And, given, the attention that you've always paid to politics and kind of, I think your keen analysis of this stuff, I'm so glad to have you on.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
So let me ask you this, Glenn. So right off the get-go, today's, we set the stage. Anybody who's been listening to this podcast, the narrative that we've been basically kind of talking about is like, okay, look, you've got, a surprisingly contested Democratic nomination process. Bernie Sanders is doing incredible. He's mobilized tons and tons of people to get out there. Not all those folks have found their way into the official political process, but, still you're talking about people who are showing up for rallies of 10, 15, 20,000 people, really kind of energized about politics. But, he's behind in the delegate count. And for all practical purposes, from my perspective, at least, Hillary's going to get the nomination. It's moving forward. But even the Democratic Party came out recently and was saying, like, look, let everybody vote. Let everybody vote. Let it go to the convention, and then we're going to move on from there. And it did not look like, from my perspective at least, that Bernie Sanders was going to try to kind of, disrupt it or run an independent campaign or any of that kind of stuff. Doesn't seem characteristic with his politics. But then last night, right before we have this big primary day, and a California primary, which is looking at, the latest polls I saw from Real Clear Politics, the aggregate of all the polls put Sanders within 2 percentage points of Clinton coming up to today's election in California, with those 546 delegates at stake. And you got that's something. And Bernie traditionally outperforms his poll numbers when it comes to these kind of open primaries or quasi-open primaries. And yet the AP last night breaks a story that, based upon its reporting on the superdelegates, that Hillary is now the presumptive nominee, and that flooded the gates. So, first of all, just let me get your, I know you kind of pay a lot of attention to media coverage and this kind of stuff of the politics. Like, what's your take on the AP stepping in like this ahead of this primary? Does it matter, or is this a problem?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think it matters that much to tomorrow's voting. I don't know that there are a lot of people. And as you mentioned, Sanders supporters are fired up. And the writing's been on the wall from day one. Mm-hmm. If you're a Sanders supporter, voting is your message in large measure. I think what happened along the way is it became possible to become more than just, voicing that opinion. It got close enough that it could, make a run at the actual nomination.
So it was no longer just a protest candidate, right? He actually, and I don't even think, even Bernie insiders have even said, that that was the expectation early on was nowhere near where they are now. They thought they were going to be able to put in a good run, maybe push the platform a little bit. But, he always said he was in it to win it. So, but you're right.
Yeah. And something pretty remarkable happened this election cycle. And both Bernie and Donald Trump are part of it. And it was, in its most crystal form, the rejection of bipartisan orthodoxy on trade. Mm-hmm. And at this point, that past practice is, RIP. I don't know where we're headed, but we're definitely not going back. So, by this point, I would imagine if you had asked Sanders' campaign when they started, what would you have hoped to have accomplished in pushing the Democratic Party toward more progressive values? They check. You know, that they've really moved on the trade agreements, the pipeline, and so on.
On Social Security, right? I mean, even he has an influence on the Social Security discussion with Obama's kind of announcement the other day.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, so it's been very effective, you know, in that sense.
Well, let me ask you, well, you know, I'm really glad you said that about the trade policy stuff, because, you know, what a lot of people I think get wrong, right, about that is they say it's just about rejection of the, you know, the establishment, or they try to kind of equate Trump and Bernie as like they're the same because they're just both angry people in different parties. But I think it's like you're talking about two very different ideological positions, yet the trade issue being, you know, front and center in what has caused this kind of impact. So, I mean, if you're sitting on the Sanders side of things, right, and you are kind of looking at what trade has done to this country, and you're looking at the Trump side, and you're looking at what it's done to this country, your reading of that is different, right? Your conclusions are different, and yet those trade policies have created that. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's so absent from so much of the discussions that we see, especially on broadcast media.
Yeah. You know, I have to think more than I can right off the top of my head, but a few issues come to mind where there's been a degree of elite consensus as on trade policy. And I think one of the things that, you know, even sort of had escaped me was the degree to which historically trade policy wasn't about trade. It was about national security. And so we signed agreements with South Korea, for example, or China, or even going back to Germany and Japan, to try and create a secure, you know, world environment. And one of the trade-offs was allowing nations to pursue policies. You know, we tell them, "Oh, be free traders," but
Right.
they would be protectionists, and that's how South Korea famously, you know, built up their economy. China. The U.S. for 200 years. And when you know, combine that with what I think, my personal view, when we say globalization, we ought to think of an ideology rather than a process. And the ideology is sort of capital first and hiring people for low wages in other countries. Right. That's not, you know, trade flows or anything like that. But so that's what's happened. And we've had now decades of this orthodoxy, and the results are becoming very clear here and even in other countries around the world. The big losers are the middle and working classes. They're pit against in classic capitalism, pit against the lowest cost labor anywhere in the world. And
you know,
so
and I think about that too, is like, and the way that distorts kind of, say, traditionally kind of standard indicators. Like, so for example, you look at the job reports that just came out, right? You know, and you know, this is a bad jobs report and so on. But even if, you know, you look at what the record has been under Obama, you see this constant kind of, you know, improvement in the job numbers. But what those jobs are, right? Job creation right now means, for the most part, the creation of more crappy jobs, right? So, I mean, where that indicator at one point you saw, okay, yeah, there's more jobs, and you're going to see, and a lot of times what that used to mean was, okay, yeah, a lot of good paying jobs, right? There was more manufacturing, there was more economic activity. But now what the economic activity is so reliant upon the kind of service industry and kind of consumption, that those numbers don't even reflect, I think, people's actual experience, you know, as a result of these policies. I don't know if you'd agree with that. That's kind of how I get my head around some of those things.
No, I think that's an important point. You know, let's give the devil his due on the job front. There is one thing, and I think it's sometimes lost. Jobs are dignity in America, and so for people to have a job is a big deal for people. People would rather have a job than a check because it gives them that sense of dignity. But the problem, as you point out, is the jobs aren't paying well. I remember back in the 90s, Tom Harkin, you may remember, the populist senator from Iowa. Problem isn't jobs. Hell, even slaves had jobs. The problem is good jobs.
Exactly.
And that's been increasingly a problem. And you're exactly right. We're just not getting well-paying jobs, and it's across many sectors of the economy. In some senses, I have this, so I don't know if I call it a metaphor or vision. Going up there, spend so much time in Iowa in the Midwest, they have the big harvesters, and they or combines, and they roll through the fields and they just churn them up and harvest stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like capital has had these rolling, harvests of various sectors of the American economy, and when it gets through, computerization, outsourcing, and so on, what you're left with is reduced labor costs, as they put it, as lower wages. Healthcare and education have been resistant because they're so human-based.
Right.
People aren't quite cottoning up to robot doctors and robot teachers.
Not yet, at least.
Right, but that obscures the degree to which technology has become a part of medicine and education. It's huge, but nonetheless, in terms of overall employment, it isn't quite had the kind of layoffs you're seeing.
No, and I think our political, this is a perfect example where our political language and organization, right, our kind of our political consciousness, I think is even a better word for this, hasn't kind of captured or hasn't won out, I should say, all those changes. Like, so for example, I can remember reading, Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy back, way back, he's, turn of the 20th century, right? 1890, I think it might've been published, something like that. And the whole idea behind that is that technology would liberate us in some degree, right? Is that work, right, was not going to be, was not going to consume as much as part of our life. It was kind of almost an extension of the fight for the 8-hour day, is that as we kind of technology was able to make production more efficient, that we wouldn't have to spend more and more of our time, like, at work, that it would be left up to, life, right? Being a human being and community and family and all this other kinds of stuff. But that concept hasn't squared with what we've done with technology. Instead, we have these things that, technology has become more a part of medicine, been more about of education, been more about production. McDonald's and all the fast food places right now are trying to look at kind of automating that process. But that's not accompanied with like, oh, great, you automate it so that people don't have to work as much, right? People can get a living wage and they can work 20 hours a week. How awesome would that be? No, that's like crazy talk in our current climate.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, Kevin. In our political science senior seminar last year, and probably we'll use it again this year, we used a book called The Rise of the Robots by Martin Ford.
Yep.
Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And essentially what he concludes is the good paying jobs aren't going to be created. And that, he comes down to the guaranteed income.
Yep.
Because, and there's compelling logic, and he makes a point, when people say, oh, well, we went from being 98% farmers to, manufacturing, we can handle this. But the thing was, people didn't go from work in farms, they went to work in other areas that weren't being overhauled. Computers today are overhauling all the areas. And that's a big difference. So there isn't a place. So you move people out of their jobs as manufacturing or, typing, whatever. There's no new sectors for them to go to that are high in employment. You look at your Googles and Facebooks, they don't have many employees. They're the biggest companies in the world, and they don't have employees.
Yep.
So it is a profound turning point or inflection point, really, for our whole culture, not just here around the world. I forget, one of the European countries actually voted on a guaranteed income.
Switzerland. Yeah. They got about 20% of the vote. And they actually saw that as a real victory, that was about increasing the conversation. Yeah.
But I think that is a conversation that kind of has to be out. That you combine, look, again, here in America with the dignity part, because we don't have the deep social welfare state of Europeans. So having a job in America is a bigger part of your identity as a person. It makes you, able to walk proud into your kitchen at night and meet your family when you have a job.
Well, and
But
I think it's, and this has been a lot of the call for the Fight for 15 movement, right? Is that
yeah,
the whole idea about, that still holding on to that idea, right? The idea that that the job actually is has value to it, right? Not just in terms of the money value, but has a value in terms of, feeling like, yes, I'm earning these things, like it's, this kind of. However, we're very, I think, precariously close to severing that connection between work and dignity, right? Work and
right,
dignity, the idea that if you're going to work, right, and you don't have dignity, you're basically in the position of miners before unionization, right, where you're
right,
basically throw away human capital. That there's, that it's hard, you got to be hard pressed to actually feel that dignity after a while. You just feel like you're being used. And I think that's kind of, where we're at. And I think you go back, the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, I think, this moment is ripe for that kind of campaign, precisely because of, of this. And you've got people finally stepping up and fighting back with, like, the Fight for 15 movement, like the Our Walmart movement, and so on.
no, and I think that historically, uh, the energy in the labor movement has often been grounded in the quest for dignity.
That's correct. Yeah.
As pay being a part of that, but the working conditions and job security and so on. Um, so when and to go back to the trade policy, so when you start questioning that aspect of the orthodoxy, it may open the door to some of these other questions. And I think what you're seeing is, left and right, a growing appreciation of the ills of concentrated power. And whether it's conscious or not, I think people are also starting to realize that it's not just concentrated political power, it's concentrated economic power. It's been kind of convenient for at least one side of the argument to kind of frame, the only power you have to worry about is Washington.
Right.
But in point of fact, I often describe, political power is kind of like energy. You can turn electricity into light and vice versa, and same with economic and political power. And so our constitutional system was not really designed with the idea of checking concentrated economic power. I humbly submit, had no concept of how concentrated economic power could become. Something like Google, Facebook, General Motors.
No, except you did have early on, right? I mean, Jefferson was one of the voices that was skeptical of the concentration of power in any form, right? I mean, that was
Yes.
that was part of, but of course his voice did not win out in that discussion.
Right. No, that's and I agree. Jefferson was radically egalitarian among the framers. He didn't think you could have a stable society with gross concentration of wealth. But by the same token, for him it was a pretty easy fix. And I don't know that it's that hard today. Progressive taxation. Tax the wealthy more, and ultimately maybe it's that. Well, yes. It may be that simple, to just, but also I think the degree to which the corporate form has come to define us. Another book we used in the senior seminar was by Douglas Rushkoff, a writer and theorist. And he made a point in one of his books that we now, all of us as individuals, think like corporations. And he used a little vignette. He got mugged like on Christmas Eve. He posted it on a bulletin board for his co-op or whatever. They're like, why'd you put the address up there? That only lower property values. He's like, nobody said, how come, are you okay?
You're right. Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And so let's bring this a little bit. We're coming up to a break in a couple of minutes, and I want to bring this back to the question of the primaries, right? So,
Yep.
I mean, I think your analysis is dead on. I mean, I think you're looking at the impact of trade and what's kind of given a lot of voice, or I say has helped build and help lend support to the this phenomenon, which has been the Bernie Sanders movement. But today's we have this is effectively the last major primary we do. So DC still has to vote next week, but today we're going to see if number one, if Hillary Clinton can actually cross that threshold of the pledged delegates, and what happens after today, right? If she does, right, or gets, has a clearly strong lead, which she again does going into the primaries today.
Right.
So one, what's your take on kind of what's going to happen today? I mean, you got any kind of predictions or senses of how the primaries are going to go? And then number two, what happens tomorrow, right, to that Democratic Party? Is the party going to be able to hold this together?
Well, those are great questions, Kevin. I do not have any advanced precognition of how the voting will turn out. The polls suggested it will be close.
Yeah.
It
looks like Hillary's going to take Jersey. I mean, pretty strongly.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking specifically of California.
Right.
And to be fair, Jersey puts her over the top, by most conventional counts. The most tricky scenario is what if Bernie wins California, and the more he wins it by, the trickier it gets. But let me just, for the sake of argument, because I'm not sure there are a lot of people making the argument that superdelegates are a good thing, that parties need a party establishment to think about the interest of the party. The Democratic Party history was back in the 70s nominating the most liberal candidate and pleased the base. And I'll just digress for a second. One of the consequences of the democratization of the nomination process after the convention in Chicago in 1968, putting it in front of primaries instead of party bosses, was it vastly increased the role of money. The party bosses used to get a nomination by persuading the Dick Daleys of the world that you could win their voters in November, and they would turn out the organization. When you had to go directly to the voters and Daley couldn't deliver the nomination, you had to reach them in the big states like Illinois or California, New York, Pennsylvania with advertising. That meant money. And that shifted the Democratic Party. They shifted from being more economically liberal to more socially liberal. That reflected the donors. One of the most dispiriting findings in political science recently has been legislators reflecting the views of their donors more accurately than their constituents. So what happened was Democrats would nominate a McGovern or even Walter Mondale back in 1984 and would lose elections. And the party establishment said, well, we would like to try and nominate candidates who have a better chance of winning. Now, that may be partly.
Let me stop you there, because there's. I mean, that's one of the well-established narratives, like what the Democratic Party, I would say, wants to tell itself, and the story that it's basically repeated through, especially the kind of Democratic Leadership Council and through the kind of the Clinton wing of the party. But there's been some recent books that have been published. I mean, you've got number one, you've got Listen Liberal, right? That's just got published by Thomas Frank, right? Who's going through, looking at some of that history and saying, and I'm upset that I can't remember this woman's name. I'll have to put her name in the show notes. But she actually published stuff before Frank, charting some of that history of what happened to McGovern. Is that the McGovern narrative is the one that said this is why we kind of shifted to this other direction, right? However, they were saying there was actually moves in the party to basically try to sever ties with working class roots. And that included McGovern. McGovern was the one who began courting the kind of new white-collar workforce that the Democratic Party ultimately shifted towards. So it's kind of like, it's not necessarily true, right? At least it's not as true as the Democratic Party, I think, wants to tell the story, that it's just a matter of that they were losing election and they had to shift. It was also a conscious decision they made to sever ties with the working class, because they were seeing that the professional class was going to be where their socially liberal, as you said, the socially liberal constituency was going to be, right? So then now you've got this scenario where we're looking back, again, this is what I fear going forward after the primaries and when Clinton secures the nomination, is that the story that's going to be told is that we can't have Bernie because Bernie is too liberal. right? You can't do this kind of stuff because Bernie is basically brought, it's like the return of the repressed, right? And he's going to basically come back and said, here's the people that have been doing the work for you, who've been doing campaigning door to door for you, that you've basically been leaving behind, especially to bring it back to where you started with the trade issue. And now, right, they're not going to do it anymore, right? And what concerns me is twofold. If we reinstate that narrative about kind of like, that's not going to win us elections, there's going to be a lot of folks, and I know a lot of people in the labor movement who are fed up with being taken for granted, right? Especially as they're watching their livelihoods being just kind of washed down the toilet.
No, I agree with a lot of what you said. Let me just kind of amplify some of those points. As I indicated, yes, the Democratic Party veered toward capital, toward upper income groups, and as I say, that to me in part is. Let's draw the two arguments together. One, I'm telling you, it's structural. They've got to raise money. You raise it from the wealthy. They created a system where you now have money is now more important than voters. The second thing, and I think you're, making this point too, is that there's this political perception of where the voters are and how you compete and how you win and win in suburbs and so on and so forth. Now, let me also lean toward the point you're making, which is, so that was, that starts in 68. Those reforms, super delegates are, roughly the 80s. A lot has changed. And one of the things that's changed, and to get your point about the Clinton model, is politics has changed how the parties campaign. Republicans for a long time have been a base party. The Karl Rove era is mobilize your base. Don't move to the center. It will demobilize our base. Democrats under Clinton's were a triangulation party. They wanted to be in the middle. But by the time of Barack Obama, campaign technology had changed to the point where parties had realized for a long time, candidates realized for a long time, you got people that, come this October are still saying, I can't decide between Trump and Hillary. They're hard to persuade. What can you tell those people? Right? But what they do know is there are a bunch of people out there say, well, if I ain't voting, but if I was voting, I'd vote for Hillary. I'd vote for those are the people that in the modern age campaigns are targeting. So it's become sort of micro-targeting of your base on both sides. So the whole notion of moving toward the middle is now less relevant because politics, marketing, American life has become more segmented, more micro-targeted, if you will. So I think that's a fair point. Now, I think if I was going to defend, the superdelegates on Bernie, and this is my one disappointment with Bernie, I don't think Bernie has done enough to defend the socialist label. You've seen these polls, and I'm going to go off the top of my head, but my sense is the polls say people would more likely vote for a Muslim or an atheiist for president than a socialist.
Well, it depends on which polls you're looking at, right? And it also understands. It also it depends on which polls you're looking at, which groups of voters that you're talking about, and how you break down what's the path for victory for a Democratic candidate, right?
No, that's true. And young voters are embracing Democratic Party. About 40 or some percent seems state after state happy with socialists. But 40% is not going to get the election. I had hoped that Bernie would have been more emphatic in defending the socialism. I mean, I think, as a political scientist, the first point you would make, there's no pure socialism. There's no pure capitalism. There's always a mixture. We've always been a mixture. What part of American socialism don't you like? Is it the Social Security? Is it our roads and bridges? Is it our public education system? Exactly where is this train off the tracks? But I just don't think that that's what's happened. And I think that there's great concern. I was in fact, and this is, politics. When Claire McCaskill, the Clinton surrogate, came out and said, the Republicans are just waiting for Bernie to get the nomination so they can break out the hammer and sickle, it made me want to support Bernie more. But the fact is, that's exactly what would happen. And, I'm not an expert, and you'll never know till you try. But if you're an establishment Democrat looking at this election, looking at that Supreme Court, and I would only point to the Republicans, Mitch McConnell, why do you support Trump? Supreme Court. It takes not a nanosecond. And one analysis of the difference in the parties, the Republican Party knows politics is an ongoing battle, their side against the other side.
That's right.
each election is just a part of that same thing. Democrats kind of get born every election cycle.
No, that's right. I mean, I think I always talk about this as one of the biggest ironies in the kind of like on the left in this country, right? Is on the one hand, we talk about kind of doing things together, about community, about collective action and all this kind of stuff. But really, the way that we behave is that we're just a bunch of individuals that get all riled up for something and then we go away, right? That we don't have that sense. And again, I think this is connected to the decline of the labor movement in this country, or I'd say not the labor movement, but the actual union density in this country, that was, the source for training people to think about organizing for the long haul, right? I mean, organizing for not tomorrow, not this election here, but for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Well, listen, I hate to cut this short, but I want to give you your one kind of follow up on this before we got to take a break. And then I want to come back and we'll talk a little about what's going on with APSCUF here. So, so your sense, so we have election today. I think, saying this probably looks like it's the way that the count is going to go. The Hillary is going to come either very close to the threshold, at least of the pledge delegates, if not go over, right? If we take the super delegates out of it, she might not get there, right? But going forward, I mean, we've got, like what, a little over a month before we hit that convention. Is this going to be a contested convention? Do you see Bernie Sanders basically saying, no, we're going to need to kind of support this? I mean, how do you see this playing out?
Right, great question. I know you may have seen story in Washington Post this morning, 2 camps within Sanders' team. They said basically the people who have been with him all along from Vermont they call them the Sanderistas. Mm-hmm. They want to fight to the end. The people who are more national in focus, including maybe Tad Devine, the campaign manager, ready to make peace with this math.
Right.
I think it's going to be hard. I guess one question is what the tone that Bernie brings to it. I don't think the nomination is in question at this point, barring some unforeseen event. And I include in that anything having to do with the email. I just don't think anything short of a federal indictment.
Well, can I just say this before I'll let you finish, but this is what pissed me off more than anything else about the AP calling this last night, right? And now there's this narrative that goes forward. And this is not to say, look, I take this email scandal, right? I think for the most part, it's just garbage. I think, frankly, the Clinton campaign has not handled it very well, right? Because, I mean, now they got her playing, say, I got permission, it was allowed. And now you've got, the federal papers start coming out. Well, no, it wasn't allowed. And if she had asked, she wouldn't have gotten approval for it. And then you get these, everything that the people there's that group of people that hate the Clintons about, she's doing right now. And that's a fault of her campaign. I mean, what she should have said, in my view, is to come out and say, look, people had done this before I done it. It had been a common practice. The fact is that our federal government has not caught up to where technology is right now. And if anything, this is a wake-up call for all of us, right, to make sure that we have to updated policies so that the stuff is going to be unclear. I said, when I came in, when I was doing this, that this was in this murky thing, and I was just doing what others before me had done. Now looking back, yes, I shouldn't have done it. But we got to, you can't go on and say that you got permission when you don't have permission, because now it looks like she's lying to everybody. But again, that's not about the merits of the case. That's just about the campaign itself.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. They just can't, for all their experience with scandal and allegation, they did not handle this well.
And that's what I was going to say, that's what pissed me off about that call from the AP and stuff, because now you have, the media is settling into this narrative. The media is kind of say, okay, we're already there. If an indictment comes down, right? And if there's something in there, like the Democratic Party now, right, the insiders in the establishment is basically lost the ability to kind of rationally assess the impact of anything that potentially comes down. Chances are it's not going to happen. But why not? Again, I think this is why the Democratic Party said, look, let everybody vote. But when the media stepped in there, now it puts it in a tough situation. Well, but listen, so yeah, go last word and we'll go to break.
Dare I say real quick, 2 things. One, that's where superdelegates come in, and they could bail on Hillary. I mean, why wouldn't they if she gets indicted or something, or horrendous for her campaign happens. But my sense is that, Bernie's goals in terms of moving the party can be met through, cooperative engagement. It doesn't require war on Hillary Clinton at this point. And so I think they can turn and pivot toward the platform and rules and so on, without continuing to contest who will become the nominee. At least, again, put that in the back burner pending any again unforeseen events. And I would think that that's ultimately where they're going to go, in part because, and let's just say this, right? So Hillary is the first woman to get a presidential nomination.
Exactly.
One of the problems we have in our society is implicit bias on things like gender and race. And one of the things is people don't see women as leaders. And one of the reasons is because they haven't been in those positions. And
it's pretty simple, right? I mean, this is all the arguments like around kind of representation, and identity and representation. This is what it comes down to. I agree 100% with that.
And so this is important for us to solve some big problems. And there's nothing so different about Hillary than other political leaders that makes her unqualified. She's quite qualified, and it is something the Democrats rightly ought to celebrate and get behind. And frankly, one of the things that does distinguish them from Republicans. And Republicans, bless their hearts, they want to say, us, no prejudice, no discrimination, let's just treat everybody the same, with no plan of action to address the bias that exists.
No, exactly. And I think that, again, if I had to wish anything, if I were looking back at the way this campaign went, is that, this is a story I keep on meaning to tell, and I'm going to tell more about this kind of in the coming weeks. But, I've had people, I've been a Bernie supporter right from the get-go. Right. But you can bet 100 percent, right? I'll bet anybody any kind of money. So when it comes down to election day this year, if Hillary's up the nomination, I'm going to vote for Hillary. Number one, it's because I understand, at the very least, like my immediate self-interest in terms of preserving the gains that have been made. I don't think that, making things worse, you need to make things worse before they get better. I don't buy that kind of logic. When it comes down to it is, my daughter, she came home from school one day and, she had gotten, I think I could Rowan, my son, so he had kind of brought at least 2 rulers and Scout. Oh no, I'm sorry. We were in DC. We were visiting DC when they both got these rulers with the presidents on them. Right. And I was sitting there with breakfast over one morning, and I'm in the kitchen, and my daughter Scout and I are sitting there, and she's looking at the ruler, and she's kind of like pointing out the presidents that she knows and stuff. She's 4. And she says, frankly, like, why are there no girls here?
Right.
And you can't tell me. And then since then, that's what their narrative. Now, she's a 4-year-old kid, right? Granted, we're a political household and things like this, but she's a 4-year-old kid that recognizes that there's a gap, that she's a girl and she has no idea why there's all this stuff here. And so we talk about that. And, that for me alone, right, that's enough. I mean, we can get all to the heady stuff, right, about Supreme Court. We get into kind of policy about what it means to actually, what's going to give us a better opportunity to actually push for a progressive agenda. I believe it is with a Democrat in the office, because they at least give lip service to progressive causes, right? So that we can push them in particular directions. But when it comes down to it, I say at the very least, that will be my deciding factor. So listen, we're coming up to a break. I let it go long today. And folks, this is one of the great things about a podcast, right? It's like, got Glenn on the program and, kind of adding whole dimensions to our discussions about this campaign that have not yet been here, right? I mean, and this is kind of one of the beauties that we can do. So I urge you, if you get a chance, right, if you've got that $2 extra a month, right, go to ragingchickenpress.org, click on the support and membership tab, and click on become a member. For little $2 a month, you can help support this work and so much more. When we come back after this break, We're going to talk a little bit about about APSCUF. APSCUF is the union that represents the faculty from the 14 state-owned universities here in Pennsylvania. APSCUF, I'm a member of APSCUF, so is Glenn. Glenn is also the chair of the state legislative committee. And they've got a big legislative event going on out in Harrisburg today. They're currently in contract negotiations and have been almost a year without a contract. And the state is pretty much dug in. And we're going to look at things where things are going forward. Glenn wrote this just freaking awesome piece, right? It's called What Our Union Does for Us. See that, folks? There it is. Right? What Our Union Does for Us. And I'm going to read a little bit of that for folks. I'm going to have them talk us through this and give us a little sense of what's going on in these negotiations for our state system faculty. This is Kevin Mahoney. I'm the editor and founder of Raging Chicken Press. This is Raging Chicken Radio's Out the Coop podcast. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Raging Chicken Radio's Out the Coop podcast. This is Kevin Mahoney. I am the editor and founder of Raging Chicken Press. Today on Out the Coop, we have got a special guest. Sean Kitchen is, of course, out in Boulder, Colorado, exploring all its glory and craft beer and whatever other things that he may find. Colorado is, of course, one of the places that has legalized marijuana. I'm not saying anything that he's doing anything with that. I'm just saying it's a coincidence, right? What we're going to do right now in this segment is I want to talk a little bit about APSCUF's contract. APSCUF is the union that represents the faculty from the state system of higher education universities. That's the 14 state-owned universities in Pennsylvania. And we're approaching working a year without a contract. This is the second time in a row that the contract negotiations between the faculty and the state system administration have been tense. Last year was almost 2 years. Our last contract negotiation was almost 2 years before faculty earned a contract. And that was after the state system looked to radically alter what the state system of higher education was going to look like, turning the bulk of our professors into poorly paid academic piece workers, basically adjuncts making about $2,000 a course, that kind of thing. The union fought that back and earned a decent contract, or at least held the line of where things are. This time around, it looks the state is once again causing these problems. So, leading up to this, we're just approaching that 1 year working without a contract. There's two sets of negotiations coming up. One is going to happen, I believe, this Friday, another one towards the end of the month. Faculty are actively preparing in the case for a job action or strike. And tonight in Harrisburg, there's going to be a legislative reception where members of APSCUF, the faculty union, will be there kind of joining with legislators to kind of talk about why it's so important to support public higher education through the budget process that's going on, but then also to try to earn a fair contract. Now, Glenn Richardson, like professor of political science and public administration at Kutztown University, he was just featured on the APSCUF's blog as a guest contributor, and he wrote this piece called "What Our Union Does for Us." And I want to read a little bit of, and then we're going to talk with Glenn about why he wrote this thing, right? Why did he feel now there's time? He had to get this off his chest. He had to write this piece, and we need to prepare for a struggle ahead. So let me set the tone. I'm going to turn it over to Glenn to talk a little about what's going on here. So here's Glenn. Quote, "In the days ahead, our union confronts a prolonged and already bitter battle over our contract set against an ongoing effort to privatize public higher education and eviscerate public employee unions. For Chancellor Frank Brogan of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, or PASHE, and his legislative allies, our contract negotiation process is public theater. We have been cast as petulant, overcompensated 17-hour-a-week employees protected by a cumbersome contract that provides swim coaches with $400,000 a year in jobs. Political pressure to curb public employee pay and pensions is high, and it is quite likely the greatest trial APSCUF has faced in our almost 80-year history. It is thus incumbent upon us to assess and, I trust, to reaffirm our common commitments." In his inaugural address, John F. Kennedy challenged Americans to, quote, "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. As a union, we are not there. Our members are asking what our union does for them. It is a question we must be able to answer enthusiastically if we are to move forward united against the challenges ahead of us. Let us then consider what our union does for us in several key areas. All right, so Glenn, I mean, that's a lot right there. Walk us through a little bit of what's going on here.
Well, it starts with the environment and the climate, and as that first paragraph states, it is a sobering environment. It wouldn't be crazy talk to say there are folks in Harrisburg that want to make their political career going after us. In a sense, a faculty union is low-hanging fruit for anti-union movement compared to going after fire or police, even the teachers. And so you have that. You have, of course, the whole Koch brothers sponsored 50-state assault on organized labor, especially public employees. So you have all that. And that really is creating a sense of urgency and, if you will, almost crisis level challenge. Now, against that threat, what we are as a faculty union, what I saw was we are faculty first, and faculty are perhaps the most individually oriented members of our society.
I think you're right.
You rise to be a faculty member by solitary work, by it is largely not a cooperative venture. I mean, there are some subfields where faculty collaborate, but the basic nature of intellectual work, the culture of it, the way we experience our job. I mean, people can go to work, an entire year and not really encounter anybody outside their narrow unit, and so on and so forth. Faculty are very intelligent and thoughtful about things. They have identities, and our identities, and faculty embrace their identity as sociologists or anthropologists, political scientists, English professors, and so on. And in that sense, it mirrors, and I hate to go back to our previous segment, but it mirrors national politics, the tribalism. And there is, it's a little bit beyond my field as a political scientist. I'll digress for a second. I joke, my first major, Kevin, was forestry. But I realized that forest decisions weren't being made by forest scientists or ecologists. They'd be made by politicians and lawyers. And now as a political scientist, I look at Washington, D.C., and I think, man, I need to be an anthropologist to understand the sort of tribal culture that is coming to define our politics. So, that's, and then and then in the academic context too, you have other levels of identity that can stand as barriers to unity. We are young, we are old, we are social sciences, physical sciences, and business. We are men, women, black, white, Latino, and all manner of possibilities. And so increasingly, in a world where social media makes us less social, these, I think, are pretty profound challenges. So I wanted to try and light the fire in our unit, our union of unity.
Well, one of the things that I always think about in terms of academic, I mean, I think what you laid out there in terms of the solitary venture that is kind of academic work, and the kind of tribalism and so on, is one of the things I always found so problematic about working in higher education, right? Being an academic, and so on, was that on the one hand, I think we do very well with the exchange of ideas. Right. I think we do well with analysis. I think we do well, with teaching our craft in our kind of, in our narrow silos, so to speak. But the one kind of knowledge, the one kind of practice that is not modeled for the most part, except in unionized universities, is the art of collective action. Right, is that idea of that, you don't need to give up your individual identity in order to join together and kind of take part in collective action. But that runs, I mean, in the complete opposite direction to those things that you were just talking about.
Yeah, it does. And so as at a practical level, and I'm not even really prepared to get into the details, say, on our campus of what this is, but just let me state, I don't think the first thing that comes to mind to faculty when we are discussing, you know, say a policy position, how we should as a union approach things, is how a union would approach them, how the collective would approach them. We approach them from, well, how our department would approach them.
Or how's this going to impact me?
How this affects research versus teaching, you know, tenure versus none, and so on and so forth. And, you know, as a political scientist, I have some insight, you know, especially teaching constitutional law, of trying to find those places, you know, John Rawls, a philosopher, talked about the veil of ignorance. What if you didn't know where you would end up in society? How would you want the rules to be? And it's a way to try and get people to detach themselves from their initial position of having a status with, you know, certain, you know, attributes. But, you know, it's a challenge, and it's an art. And one of the things, you know, that I think we've kind of lost a little bit. You go back, I don't know if you've seen, HBO has been running the LBJ All the Way documentary about that year 64 and how he gets his box bill through. There's fascinating conversations. The back and forth with him and Dr. King, you know, is historic and gripping, but it's all about, you know, collective action and giving up, you know, stuff. King had to swallow no voting rights in the 64 bill. And, you know, there's just this great dialogue, Kevin. LBJ's, you know, trying to sell King on this, and he wants to sort of, you know, King wants voting rights, and so LBJ, you know, the persuasion. Well, you know, my chef Zephyr, she drives my Cadillac down to the ranch, you know, every fall. She's got to step out of the car and pee in the fields because she can't use the bathroom. We're going to fix that.
Yep.
And then Dr. King, right? You know, well, nothing will really change till black people have the right to vote. And he said, well, we're going to get that. We're going to get that, but we can't just get it this time. And then King's like, you know, President Eisenhower said the Republicans may have made a mistake in taking the black vote for granted. I'd hate to see the Democrats make that same mistake. LBJ looks at him. If you think Barry Goldwater is a legitimate heir to Abraham Lincoln, I suggest you vote for him. And King, you know, got the smile on his face. But that's, you know, that's the sort of back and forth about a collective task in a political context that I don't think we value or appreciate. Today, we value or appreciate expression. The purer, the better. You know, tap into, you know, our emotional centers. And that gives purity. And LBJ, King, going back, you know, to Lincoln, to that purity, you know, it is mixed. it can't be unalloyed. And I think that's something that can get lost. You know, yeah, a union contract is a little bit cumbersome, but it brings the best for all.
Yep. And I think, you know, one of the things I always, and this is, you know, again, my field is in composition rhetoric. I study rhetoric, political rhetoric, and so on. And one of the things that I always tell my students was that, you know, one of the things that got me to study rhetoric and not philosophy, because I'm a big theory head too as well. I love theory, I love philosophy. I said, but you know, what led me to rhetoric is because in my view, right, when you're looking at some disciplines like the theory disciplines and philosophy, very often the question is, you know, what is, you know, truth, capital T or lower t, whatever you want. What is the truth, and how do we get to that point of that, you know, what you're talking about, this kind of purity to understand what is good in those big questions? Again, fundamentally essential question to know. What rhetoric does, right, in my view, right, what we do with rhetoric is say, okay, we do all that stuff, right, but then the question is like, okay, now how do we act? Right. And that acting is never from a pure space, right? Because we don't live in a pure world. So that's that whole idea is, okay, given that we know, and then given what our rhetorical situation is, given that is, you know, what is, how do we then therefore act? And, there's a lot of, I think, academics who get very uncomfortable with that because that means that you can't act from that pure space. But, I think that, we've been taught, and I mean, in higher education in general, we're being taught by experience that these attacks on higher education are not going away. I think the veil of, ivory tower ignorance or kind of privilege, let's say, has been cracked to the point where people are saying, no, I think we need to act if we're going to save this thing that we believe in. Higher education, public higher education, right. Access for everybody in our society to actually go as far as they can with education, and how important that is for the success of our democracy. Then we're going to have to defend it, and it means that we're going to have to get dirty, right? We have to get down into it, and make sure that we draw the line and say no more. We're going to defend this like it's nobody's business.
Kevin, I couldn't have said it better, and I think that that's just a great and valid point. If you think about, say, some of the issues that divide faculty, and this is going to your previous point about rhetoric, say standards for tenure and promotion. Few things, are more important to faculty, and would be to any employee. Right, than job security and promotions and so on. The purism you find is out there. There are faculty that want to say, well, let's have certain set of standards or something. Let's do this. And I found myself in one of our faculty meetings saying, well, from political science perspective, where the Supreme Court divides 5-4 on all these questions. That certainty isn't there. We just have to embrace the rhetorical moment, if you will, as you outlined it, and where you make your cases and you build the basis for action. But I think that's a tricky sell for at least, people who are academically trained to seek more black-white type of answers. I mean, I think fields like rhetoric, political science, are different in that they have to recognize the contested nature of truth and reality.
Absolutely. Well, and I'll tell you, I hope all the best in this. And we're going to look to have some folks on from APSCUF to talk more specifically about what's going on in contract negotiations kind of in the coming weeks. And we will certainly follow the development about whether or not this will be the first ever strike by the state system of higher education faculty, the APSCUF members that are fighting for access to public higher education. So listen, this has been an awesome episode. Want to thank once again Glenn Richardson for joining us today on this special edition of the Out to Coop, where we got into the weeds a bit on political theory and talked a little bit about future directions of the Democratic Party and talked about the struggle that is looming right here in the state of Pennsylvania for the APSCUF faculty, the public higher education in the state of Pennsylvania and across the country, frankly. So Glenn, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Kevin. Pleasure's mine.
All right, man. So I'm sure going to be seeing you in the coming days as I'm going to be heading back to campus, because not only am I sitting here doing this podcast and a member of APSCUF, but I'm also the strike captain at Kutztown University. So there'll be some organizing going on this summer. All right. This has been Raging Chicken Radio's Out to Coop podcast. We'll be joined next week by, we don't know yet, might be Sean Kitchen once again, if we can get him on the phone, or we might have another special guest. We'll see. So thanks everyone for tuning in. This is Kevin Mahoney, editor and founder of Raging Chicken Press. We're out of here as my phone is ringing. See ya.